One of our cutters heard just Mayday, Mayday, and that's all we heard.
Oh, look, an explosion. We turned in what looks like fireworks, and then all of a sudden it turned into this big orange fireball.
I pulled out of the water myself a fully inflated life preserver. There was no body in it, but it was fully strapped, which there was a body in it evidently.
An electrostatic spark ignited the plane's center wing tank is considered the leading theory in the investigation.
On July 17, 1996, Trans World Airlines Flight 800 left New York's Kennedy Airport en route to Paris. 12 minutes later, that flight ended in tragedy. 10 miles off the coast of Long Island on that still, clear summer night, a powerful explosion sent the 747 jumbo jet into a tranquil Atlantic Ocean. The subsequent investigation cost more than $35 million, examining a host of questions. Did radar reveal signs of a missile approaching the plane? Did explosive residue in the wreckage indicate a terrorist attack? Did the 747 harbor a fatal engineering flaw? After 4 years of study, the National Transportation Safety Board has issued its final report. A wiring flaw, say board members, was the probable cause of the accident. But independent analysts have disputed the government's conclusions. And in the following hour, we'll hear from many of those drawn to the case. Government officials, independent investigators, eyewitnesses, and family members of the victims. TWA 800, the search for the truth.
This is a special report from ABC News.
Good evening, this is Chris Wallace at ABC News headquarters in Washington, where we have just gotten the first sketchiest details of an apparent air tragedy. A TWA jetliner flight 800 bound from New York to Paris, leaving from Kennedy Airport on Long Island, has apparently crashed in the Atlantic. There you can see the map, and it apparently crashed in the Atlantic.
507, I'm sorry, I missed it. You're at 18, did you say something else?
We just saw an explosion. They have us here, somewhere about 16,000 feet or something like that. It just went down.
Chaos reigns in the Islip Air Traffic Control Center.
The probe got out of my 9 o'clock position. We just had an explosion out there about 5 miles away, 6 miles away.
This is among the world's busiest air traffic corridors. TWA took off late in the place of an Israeli El Al flight. Has Flight 800 become the mistaken target of a Middle Eastern terrorist attack?
We are directly over the site with that airplane, or whatever it was, just exploded and went into the water.
Could friendly fire be involved? Early reports suggest that the U.S. Navy has activated Whiskey 105, part of the U.S. military's massive giant killer offshore testing range. Has a war game gone terribly wrong?
TWA 800, Center.
I think that was him.
I think so.
My older sister Nan called at 10:30 and said, turn on the TV. There's been a plane crash, TWA Flight 800, and I think Andy was on it. My husband, who's in the Navy, was on a fast attack submarine, the USS Pittsburgh. They were in the Mediterranean, so I didn't have his support. And then I went into the kitchen, I laid down on the floor, and it felt like someone punched me in the stomach.
In the wake of the catastrophe, the National Transportation Safety Board, under Chairman Jim Hall, sends expert traffic investigators to Long Island. They're joined by agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, under the supervision of the FBI Assistant Director, James Kallstrom.
You can email us at newyork@fbi.gov for any citizens out there that have anything they want to tell us about this investigation.
The task is daunting. Tons of debris scattered for miles along the ocean floor. And a flood of phone calls from local residents. More than 750 people claim to have witnessed the final seconds of the flight. Approximately 250 describe seeing an object approach the aircraft in the moments before it exploded. 96 of those witnesses describe seeing an object rise from the surface and impact TWA 800.
It was this brittle, shatter, white puffball on the side of the plane, and I'm very relieved because I figured that it didn't impact on the plane, so the plane will be all right. But at the same time, I see this other object that's coming up from underneath the plane, in the shadow of the plane, that looks just like this other object had been. And then the plane stopped in the middle of the sky from where it was, and it's just stopped there in the sky, and then it goes down, and then I can see all along the spine of the plane, and then the plane shatters.
Started to head outbound towards the horizon, and it was traveling with increasing speed, and traversed and went outbound until it got to about 10 degrees or so above the horizon. I lost track of it for about a second or two in between. I saw a flash. Then I saw another flash, which was appeared to come up from the horizon. All of that action eventually culminated in a huge fireball, a yellow fireball. And that fireball just dropped into the ocean like a rock and left a black smoke trail on its way down into to the horizon. I called the U.S. Coast Guard. I got the Mauritius Coast Guard station, told them my name, said I just witnessed a fire and explosion offshore, gave them my position. And I was immediately told that that was the Air National Guard firing flares tonight. And I said, nope, this wasn't a flare. This looked like somebody shot themselves in the foot.
I saw what appeared to be the sort of course and trajectory that you see when a shooting star enters the atmosphere.
I saw a streak of light moving to my left, almost horizontally across the sky, but with a gradually ascending arc. It was moving very rapidly. And then on the same trajectory, slightly further to the left, I saw a high-velocity explosion. Approximately 2 to 3 seconds later, further to the left, and slightly lower than the initial trajectory, I saw a second high-velocity explosion. And it was brilliant white light.
But if you had to bet the store or the farm, what was it? Where was it from?
It was a rocket motor of some kind. Remember, my experience with missiles goes back to the late 1960s. And a missile that would fly in the 1960s, except for a SAM-1 or SAM-2, which were very big and very heavy. The smaller missiles, SAM-7s, things of that nature, those are designations for Soviet Union missiles, would have an infrared homing system, and they would have an erratic flight path. So when you saw a missile fly through the sky, you'd see this very squirrely, erratic flight path. And what I saw was a smooth arc. And what I saw explode in the sky was definitely military ordnance. I have enough experience with it to know what it looks like. And I saw 1, 2, 3, 4 explosions before I saw the fireball. So the fuel in this aircraft eventually exploded, but the explosion of the fuel was the last event, not the initiating event. The initiating event was a high-velocity explosion, not fuel. It was ordnance.
Happened to look out the window. I happened to notice down to the lower right side of my field of vision what appeared to be some kind of a flare-like object. And it appeared to be climbing. And I continued to watch it fall probably for about 7 to 10 seconds. It appeared to be climbing, and just as it peaked at its apex, I saw what appeared to be a small explosion, ball of flame, red, yellow, orange colors, dark, different shades within it. Oh, and then maybe about a second or two later, if even that long, it became a much larger ball of flame, much larger explosion. The gentleman that was behind me on the U.S. air flight indicated, I was reading one of the statements, he said he saw the cabin lights of Flight 800
just prior to the explosion. So, you know, the timing is perfect as far as what I saw, the flare-like object that I saw, him seeing Flight 800, and then the explosion, and then, you know, it all went from there.
It proceeded from behind the roof line up on a 30, 35 degree angle, and it appeared to be going parallel to the shoreline, but maybe a little bit out to sea. It varied in its elevation. At sideways, it zigzagged. One up on like about a 30 degree angle outward, arced over and disappeared. And a couple seconds later, a big orange ball erupted in the sky.
A tangled mess of switches, seats, and secrets. The cockpit of Flight 800 raised from the ocean floor. Will the shattered section finally reveal what brought down a mighty airliner?
We know there was an explosion on the airplane, and the scenarios are there was a bomb on the plane was hit with a rocket, or there was a mechanical, electrical, or some malfunction on the plane that caused the plane to explode.
This was by nobody's account a typical crash investigation. It was the FBI, not the NTSB, that oversaw the reconstruction of TWA 800 in a hangar in Calverton, New York. FBI investigators oversaw the handling and examination of evidence. It was the FBI that interviewed all witnesses.
CNN called
Dr.
me.
Vernon Gross is a former member of the National Transportation Safety Board.
Early this morning, we were hearing that the FBI had taken the lead in the investigation. Now we're hearing they may take the lead in the investigation. That's not unprecedented, of course, with the FBI in the lead of an airline disaster, but it is unusual, is it not?
Well, I actually think it's unprecedented because by a mandate of the Congress, there is one body, the National Transportation Safety Board, that is entirely charged with the investigation of any transportation accident.
Several radar sites were monitoring the airspace off Long Island, capturing on tape the final moments of the flight. But none of those images surfaced publicly until a VHS tape appeared in the mailbox of veteran pilot Richard Russell. Allegedly radar data from JFK Airport, leaked by an old colleague inside the crash investigation.
I knew that there was something wrong, something that was amiss. A controller had identified a target on the videotape as a missile. The FBI came to my home and removed it under a subpoena from the grand jury. I said that it would probably be dubbed as a fraud, and they did. The next few days, they said no, it was a true tape.
1 month after the tragedy, the lead story in the New York Times, sophisticated FBI explosive detecting gear has identified traces of high explosives in a dozen locations on the plane's right side. The test was conducted as long as 2 weeks ago, investigators said. But instead of announcing the finding then, FBI officials decided to take extraordinary precautions to keep the findings secret as long as possible.
Federal officials disputed a report in the New York Times which claimed the front landing gear contained evidence that a bomb went off inside the plane. And an analysis of the cargo bin and fuselage retrieved Monday has not turned up any evidence of chemical residue as officials had hoped.
The NTSB and the Federal Aviation Administration are overseen by the Congressional Subcommittee on Transportation.
On February 10th, we began construction of a three-dimensional reconstruction of 92 feet of the aircraft. This is one of our metallurgists standing in the wing tank. When finished, this construction will be the largest in the world. In these pictures, which were taken on March 6th, over 70 feet of aircraft have been reassembled.
How about these theories? Does one leap out at you more than the other?
Not yet. I'm still of the school to keep all options open if it's possible. When you have a high explosion, you have disintegration of all material in the vicinity of the explosion. In a soft fuel-air explosion, it peels the metal back, and that's what it showed at Calverton when they put it back together.
In addition, we have also reconstructed the interior of the aircraft, putting the seats and galleys back together again.
But they always showed you only the right side, the starboard side of the airplane. when I saw photographs of the left side with that large indentation forward of the wing, then I immediately was curious what in the world could cause it to be dented in. It would have to be something external to the aircraft. And though I didn't buy necessarily the missile theory, in fact, I had debated Pierre Salinger for 40 minutes on his idea, which I don't think had validity, about a missile coming head-on at the aircraft. Nonetheless, I was really, at this point, upset that we hadn't heard about that evidence.
Mr. Kelsman, being that a missile is still one of the theories, is there anything being done to protect other aircraft from a possible missile if that is still one of the theories?
Yeah, I said earlier, and would continue to say, that any information that comes up in this investigation that is particularly on point to the traveling public, in particular the air traveling public, has been made available to the FAA.
This part right here, okay?
Then a new theory emerges, a theory that will become the government's final word on the tragedy that befell TWA 800.
TWA crash investigators are wondering if a well-known fact of aviation and a conversation in the cockpit shortly before the crash could suggest a reason why TWA Flight 800 blew up. On the voice cockpit recorder, the 747's engineer is heard beginning the process of cross-feeding, that is, moving fuel through various fuel tanks. Now, the National Transportation Safety Board plans tests to see how much static electricity could have been created by that action. The theory that an electrostatic spark ignited the plane's center wing tank is considered the leading theory in the investigation.
It was this theory that a defect in the plane's center wing tank destroyed the 747 that created a furor that has raged to this day.
When I saw that cartoon, I was on a mission.
We've got independent investigators, family members, and eyewitnesses that just don't buy the FBI and the NTSB's story.
We know a missile brought the aircraft down. I spent 2.5 years in submarines in World War II, became a naval aviator thereafter, went up the carrier route, culminating in command of one of our big carriers. In combination with the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Tom Moore, we agreed to be part of what is really an informal association.
In the first place, there's no question about the fact that our airplane was shot down. There's no question about the fact that that airplane makes that same flight practically every day. There's no question about the fact that there was, I don't know, hundreds of witnesses saw what was clearly a rocket rise from the surface of the sea, apparently, and strike the aircraft.
And one of the witnesses that was not able to testify in that first press conference was Captain Mundo. He had been a TWA captain with, I think, at least 3,000 hours of experience or more in the 747. He knew that airplane. He had flown as the flight engineer from Athens to Kennedy before that airplane took off a few hours later. As part of his duty was to adjust the fuel throughout the aircraft. They use the center wing tank. It has a sump pump, and he used that sump pump to take out any residual jet fuel and any water that's present, as there always is some water present, and that's why they have the sump pumps. And then they took off 3 hours later, about, from Kennedy in another cross-ocean flight. And I asked Captain Mundo, you telling us here that you evacuated that tank, why was it not filled in the next flight? He said, because instead of going as far as Athens, they were only going to Paris and they didn't need it. Consequently, we know that tank was empty. Well, that means it had a thimbleful of kerosene or the equivalent vapor. This is a huge tank. What's bigger than this room, literally? And there's no way that you can ignite a thimbleful of kerosene and blow off the left wing of the strongest airplane ever built.
I am, in fact, Commander William S. Donaldson, U.S. Navy, retired. Currently a chief investigator for an organization by the name of ARAP, Associated Retired Aviation Professionals. Caltech spent I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of dollars using a blowtorch, literally at 20 times atmospheric pressure, trying to get this kerosene to light. Well, they finally got it to do it. Then NTSB calls it an explosion. And in a letter, the last letter I wrote to Mr. Hall, I told him, you put a fireman in that tank with the proper apparatus and a fire suit, asbestos or whatever they use now, he could have sat there during the middle of their explosion because the max pressure was about 39 pounds per square inch. How does that destroy an aircraft like this?
Part of this, we're going to make it a mechanical, and we need to have an internal explosive force going outward and downward. They took the pieces, these large pieces of the floor of the center wing tank that they recovered, they put them out over that keel beam and massively shoved them downward.
James Sanders is a retired cop and investigative journalist.
So you have this U-shaped floor of the center wing tank
as the plane is now
it.
reconstructed at Calverton.
Correct, but I have the photos.
How do you know that it's been bent down by somebody?
Because I have the photos of these large pieces of the floor of the center wing tank shortly after they were brought into the hangar. They don't have that bend in them.
Later, before a Senate committee, NTSB official Hank Hughes, assigned the task of reconstructing the plane's interior, painted a picture of investigative impropriety he claimed to have witnessed at Calverton.
But I actually saw this man with a hammer pounding on a piece of evidence trying to flatten it out.
What was the purpose of his doing that?
I have no idea, sir. Another problem that occurred, and it was recognized about 2 months into the investigation, was the disappearance of parts from the hangar. We found that seats were missing and other evidence had been disturbed. The FBI, on my last complaint, did act, and they found that 3 o'clock on the Saturday morning, 2 or 3 of their own agents were in our hangar. It was not authorized. I supervised that project, and these people had no connection to it.
On March 10th, 1997, when the Press Enterprise in Riverside, California, put out a story that an old retired cop turned investigative reporter had forensic evidence of red residue that was consistent with a solid fuel missile there, and I might add since then that same evidence has forensically been tested from down in here, has the same elements as my test up here, except the all-important chlorine, which is the oxygen that a solid fuel has to have in order to perform, is also down in here.
What did the residue tell you? What did you find out by having residue taken from the wreckage that was obtained by you?
The residue told me that it was consistent with 2 things. Initially, I said the one thing. It's consistent with 2 things. It's consistent with an incendiary warhead on top of a solid fuel missile. I had that analysis done by a recently retired scientist who worked in the warhead industry and had a background in solid fuels. He was the first one that took it the next step from being consistent with solid fuels to saying, no, you've got this 18% magnesium and this 12% calcium. So Sanders, you're looking at a current generation incendiary warhead. And I've confirmed through multiple Navy pilots that indeed that is current generation technology, the incendiary warhead concept for anti-aircraft missiles.
Tom Stallcup is a physicist and head of FIRO, the Flight 800 Independent Researchers Organization.
But the residue, Sanders just did elemental analysis, getting a little technical here, but he found things like magnesium and silicon and things like that. And yeah, you find some of those things in other materials, but not in those percentages.
Who finds the fenton in the RDX?
Once you find them, you know it's an explosive.
Who's found them, and how do you know
The FBI. That's true. That's 100%. They admit that. And they say there's no evidence of a missile. Why?
Does the FBI have any information about the red residue that has not been shared with the safety board?
We have no information from the FBI or any information from our own investigators to substantiate the theory that's in the newspaper article. Nevertheless, we're going to take a very close look at everything that has been raised.
Sanders' chemical residue had been extracted from small squares of the 747 seat material furnished by a whistleblower, a senior manager at TWA. In a highly public and highly unusual case, the Justice Department arrested Sanders and his wife Liz, raising alarm among many that a journalist was being persecuted in the pursuit of his investigation. They were convicted of aiding and abetting the removal of material from an airplane crash site, but the judge suspended their sentences. The case is under appeal.
Take us over and show us what testing was done.
Earlier reports of explosive residue on the right side of the wreckage at Calverton had been shelved by investigators. Most laid to rest when secondary analysis turned up negative at the FBI's Washington, D.C. crime lab. Said the New York Times, certain federal agents, calling the FBI's laboratory in Washington a black hole, remained convinced that the Bureau was hiding its positive lab confirmations. Mr. Sanders' conclusions were likewise rejected by FBI investigators. Chemicals said to be exhaust residue were described instead as common industrial glue, and explosive residue found in the plane's interior attributed to bomb training exercises conducted earlier aboard the 747.
It's brought in containers onto the aircraft. The trainer, the dog trainer, takes it out of the can, making sure to not cross-contaminate, places it wherever it is, whether it's the dead cord or the C4 or the powder, places that around, then lets the dog come in, find it.
They said it was spilled in St. Louis on June 10th, and the officer who did the exercise said he left the plane no later than 12:15 p.m. The plane took off at 12:35 to Hawaii, fully loaded with passengers, caterers. The catering was already done. 400 people went to Hawaii. They boarded that plane an hour before, at least. So how can that be explained? Well, right next door there was another 747 that took off at 1:30. That's where the bomb training exercise most likely took place. Furthermore, let's say, okay, given the benefit of the doubt, the guy was wrong. He left the plane at 11, and everyone loaded after him. Well, he didn't do the exercise in the same place they detected the explosives. They detected the explosives on external plane parts. They detected explosives in the passenger cabin where most of the damage was done to the aircraft. That's where these explosives were. That's evidence. Now there are documents that I can show you that show Whiskey 105 being activated that day.
Activated as a naval operations area?
Yes.
Where everybody
military.
else keeps out, or what happens?
Yes. It's just it's a warning. They send a notice to mariners and things like that. These documents came from the Navy directly, so it's not even from the Coast Guard. The documents say, yes, Whiskey 105 was hot that day.
Stallcup and fellow investigators have used radar data to plot the movement of surface ships around Whiskey 105 on the night of the TWA disaster. Many of those vessels remain unidentified, including several heading away from the site of the disaster at high speed. The Navy originally denied having warships in the area, a claim undercut by James Kallstrom, the FBI's lead investigator, in a conversation with Reed Irvine of Accuracy in Media. Why is Accuracy in Media involved in the TWA 800 investigation?
TWA 800 investigation is very important because it gets to the heart of the question of, can we have a government that is so dishonest that it covers up the cause of a tragedy that killed 230 people?
Let's open up the report. Let's open up the record. Let's take off the secrecy.
Yeah, well,
that's the point.
Yeah, I think I think it would be good to do that at this point now that the criminal case is not open. But it's in the hands of NTSB. I don't know what they're doing as to come up.
The Bureau just sent Traffic Canada a letter saying they couldn't identify 3 vessels that were in the vicinity for privacy reasons. Come on.
Well, yeah. Well,
they don't know what the...
We all know what those were, and in fact, I even spoke about those.
What were they?
Publicly.
Okay, what are they?
They were naval vessels that were on classified maneuvers.
It also shows something very peculiar was an aircraft was coming in and out of this military warning zone with the high performance characteristics. This aircraft would come out of the warning zone, slow it from at 300 knots, slow down to 100 knots in 30 seconds, take a left turn, continue onward, take another U-turn, all increase into 200 knots, slowing down to 100 knots, coming back in. Did this 3 times. Wow, Flight 100 crashed.
We have the Navy's own radar in its final sweep, 12-second sweep, coming around towards Flight 800. Well, where that Navy radar would sweep down towards the missile that Brumley saw, the Navy expunged that part of the database from the record before they would give it to us, and only in that narrow area. All of those things go very strongly towards saying that it was friendly fire. And then when you add the fact that if you objectively look at what Paul Angelides and the Angelides cluster of witnesses saw and what Brumley saw, the distances to Flight 800 from where these people are looking are too great for it to have been a shoulder-fired missile. You bring it above shoulder-fired missile, it's almost impossible for a terrorist to have a delivery system of 2 missiles of substantial size within days of my becoming involved in the investigation and the possibility of friendly fire. I had a retired Air Force colonel, of all people, who worked in these areas before he retired. He said that if, in fact, it ended up being friendly fire, that you would have 2 missiles and not 1. Because the way he put it was if the Navy, he was immediately blaming the Navy, being retired Air Force, if the Navy was stupid enough to have an exercise that close to commercial traffic, they would at least be smart enough to have a backstop missile. And I believe that that is the combination we're looking at. A backstop missile close into shore is fired to try to take out the errant first missile, and just one of those unfortunate things that happens. They met, coming from opposite directions, they met at Flight 800.
A commercial salvage vessel was available almost immediately to begin recovering debris after the crash of Flight 800. It was not used. Instead, 2 Navy salvage boats steamed for 2 days up from Norfolk. In the midst of the investigation, President Clinton issued an executive order lifting the government's normal whistleblower protections for those involved in the salvage operation.
Newspaper articles indicate that the Navy has been reluctant to share information with the Safety Board.
Well, Mr. Chairman, most of that portion of the investigation has been done by the FBI rather than by the Safety Board. I'm not aware of anything that we have requested from the Navy that we have not received full cooperation from.
To use national security to hide the location of naval units the night an airplane crashes, that's highly suspicious.
Is it suspicious or simply stupid?
Both.
I'd volunteer to go back on active duty so I could court-martial the son of a bitch if he ever pulled the trigger on a missile that big, that close to New York.
Rumors that it was an accident from a misguided missile from a U.S. Navy ship or aircraft, I felt was impossible. From my experience, there's almost no way to keep anything as catastrophic as that secret in the military in a normal ship or squadron organization. I am unfamiliar with any naval exercise per se. I do know that there was a P-3 patrolling the area, but they're not equipped to fire anything like a Stinger missile.
And obviously, one clear factor that is of great concern is this letter, this threat that was faxed into an Arab-speaking newspaper, an Arab-language newspaper in both Washington, D.C. and in London. What can you tell us about what was said in that letter?
Well, the letter was definitely a letter that threatened physical harm to Americans in some place. It was not specific to Long Island. Government officials are saying they don't believe that it was predictive of this particular event.
The warning was we're going to, some epithet about the president and the silly president and the stupid American, you know, the standard stuff, but we're going to strike. We're going to strike at dawn, and you'll be surprised where and how. Well, that came in about 6 hours before the event, roughly. If you look at, now, of course, 8:30 at night is not dawn. It is dawn on the Saudi Arabian, yes, and Mecca, almost exactly dawn. I took the manual that I found on the Alpha Omega out of Massachusetts, one of the contract boats, took it into the Congress, waved it around, showed them the map, the dredging map. Right on the map it says suspected missile launch zone, big red circle, 2.7 nautical miles. What they were trying to do was find the first stage of a Stinger.
Tactical readiness was a design requirement for Stinger. The missile is packed in a disposable launch tube and is delivered as a certified round, requiring no field testing or direct support maintenance. The gunner inserts the identification friend or foe IFF connector, and when the target has been visually acquired, aligns the target in the open sight.
And when the missile's launched, it's a tube-mounted thing that sits on your shoulder. And when the gunner sits there and he has he thinks it's in range, he starts the battery cooling, and the seeker head starts cooling down. And when he really thinks he's got the shot, he pulls the trigger. Now, if the missile was to go out at full power, it would kill the shooter. Okay, so what they designed is a little tiny can. It's called an ejector can. It's a rocket fuel about the size of a Coke can. And it fits right on the back of the missile in the tube. It fires while the missile is still in the tube. The whole charge goes boom, just like a bazooka round, for those that understand how that works. So it shoots the missile out about 100 feet, and then the main motor lights. Well, it kicks off that can, and it drops in the water, and it sinks. That's physical evidence.
Early in the investigation, the FBI had worked diligently to chase down evidence of a terrorist operation, searching boats known to have been off the Long Island coast, mapping possible missile launch points with the assistance of eyewitness testimony.
I know the agents that were out there on the boats. They were carrying live ordnance to show to these captains. And you know what? The first day they went aboard was right after the '96 election. It was like November, early November. And they showed it to one of the first crews on these 4 boats. They said, oh yeah, we've already found one of them and thrown it back over. The first missile, not the second missile, hit the left wing root, went into this #2 main tank, and exploded. When it did that, it blew out all the internal supports along the fuselage here. It blew into the center wing tank, which was empty. The center wing tank, many seconds later, did explode in a huge explosion along with other fuel way down at 7,500 feet. The initiating event was up at 13,820 feet exactly.
An explanation in line with the conclusion of another investigation by the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. The center wing fuel tank did explode. We find that its explosion was as the result of the aircraft breakup. The initial event caused a structural failure in the area of Flight Station 854 to 860, lower left side of the aircraft. A high-pressure event breached the fuselage, and the fuselage unzipped due to the event. The explosion was a result of this event.
A cigarette boat, a very high-speed, small boat, could easily go from the spot where they launched the missile at roughly 30 knots, get out to sea, be picked up by a mothership, sink it, and be gone. That's an example, just an example.
The last airplane shot down that I'm aware of was in Africa. It was a 727. It ate 2 SA-7s. That only cost that rebel group that shot them down about 10 grand. If you cover up the truth of what happened to this airplane, for whatever the political reason, you've done world aviation a tremendous disservice, because the threat is there. This was the 27th large aircraft hit by these missiles in the last 15 years. Not all of them went down.
Following 16 months of unprecedented investigation, effort which extended from the shores of Long Island to several countries abroad, an investigation where hundreds of investigators conducted thousands of interviews, an investigation which was confronted with the obstacles of having the most critical pieces of evidence lying in 130 feet of water at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. We must now report that no evidence has been found which would indicate that a criminal act was the cause of the tragedy of TWA Flight 800.
So what this represents is if there was a missile that blew up outside the plane and pieces of the missile warhead shrapnel came through, what it would look like in different thicknesses of this material and at different velocities. So we could then take what we learned here, the scientists could, they could put this in their database and come here and compare it to the different holes and punctures that we see in the plane.
There were 430 passenger seats and 21 crew seats, had their seat covers removed, and they were commingled in a dumpster. About 2 months into the investigation, I went to the dumpster with the assistance, I have to say, of an FBI agent, and tried to sort out the materials in there. And we found, in addition to the seat covers, actual seats that had been missing that were mistakenly thrown in there.
The most important part of the investigation turned out to be, I understand, over 150 witnesses who had seen from various angles something rising from the surface.
Most of my Air Force career was in the intelligence business, dealing with missile and space kinds of issues. I have looked at aircraft that have been hit by missiles, both air-to-air and ground-to-air missiles. I've interviewed pilots who actually saw the missiles and other pilots who were in the area and not necessarily the target, who also gave descriptions of what the missile looked like. These were very consistent with the eyewitness descriptions that I read for people that saw this incident.
The eyewitness testimony collected by the FBI was not unsealed until 1999. Amongst the interviews, scores of diagrams documenting one or two objects rising from the surface and intercepting TWA 800. And the FBI took those accounts seriously, taking the unusual step of inviting a sister agency, the CIA, to produce a video explaining this eyewitness testimony.
I'm just going to play the CIA, what the CIA told all of you and all of us on national TV, November 18th, 1997.
The 21 eyewitnesses whose observations began earlier described what almost certainly was the aircraft in various stages of crippled flight after it exploded. Those who said they saw something ascend and culminate in an explosion probably saw the burning aircraft ascend and erupt into a fireball just after it reached its maximum altitude. From a distance of 9 miles or more, this may have looked like a missile attacking an aircraft. But nothing in their statements leads CIA analysts to conclude that these eyewitnesses in fact saw a missile. The airliner should have been visible to any observer witnessing a missile approach it. So the eyewitnesses almost certainly saw only the burning aircraft without realizing it. To date, there is no evidence that anyone saw a missile shoot down TWA Flight 800. Initial speculation that a missile was involved was based totally on the statements of eyewitnesses who were seeking to assist the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Transportation Safety Board as these agencies probed into the possible causes of the tragedy. Without the assistance of these eyewitnesses, the accounting given here would not have been possible.
I watched a press conference from the FBI, and the press conference released a video produced by the CIA, which is very dramatic, and it had an animation of the plane coming across the sky and losing its front section and climbing sharply. And throughout the video, they kept saying, not a missile. Could not have been a missile, no way. Eyewitnesses didn't see a missile, and it seemed like more of a propaganda piece than an investigative effort.
According to the FBI and CIA, the 747, crippled by the explosion in its center wing tank, lurched upward, rapidly rising 3,000 feet and creating the illusion of objects rising toward the aircraft.
So the flare-like object he saw almost certainly was Flight 800 just after it exploded, not a missile.
Mike Wire's account of the disaster figured prominently in the CIA's video animation, as internal NTSB documents revealed. He was an important witness to us, and we asked the FBI to talk to him again, and they did. In his original description, he thought he had seen a firework, and that perhaps that firework had originated on the beach behind the house.
They said they had the FBI re-interview him, and on the second interview, he said, oh no, it was up high in the sky when he saw it. That's not true. First interview was soon after the crash, a week after the crash. The second interview was a week after that. The CIA wasn't working on this theory in July of 1996. So they made up this story about having had it re-interviewed.
The eyewitness was able to specify a landmark over which the white light first appeared, a house near the beach. So the white light the eyewitness saw very likely was the aircraft briefly ascending and arching over after it exploded, rather than a missile attacking the aircraft.
Once again, the CIA analysis. The conclusion that the eyewitnesses were only seeing the burning aircraft was made at 10 p.m. at night on the 30th of December, 1996. There was a realization, having all the data laid out, that you can explain what the eyewitnesses are seeing with only the burning aircraft. But the animation does not comport with what you saw from here or what you told people you saw from here.
Definitely not.
When the CIA showed that plane climbing, I think it was 3,000 feet, I was flabbergasted.
When I went to the Coast Guard station in East Moriches to give my interviews to the media, I went to a trailer there, which was an FBI trailer. I knocked on the door, they opened the door, and I told them who I was and told them I wanted to give them a statement. They looked around for somebody. There were 5 of them standing there, and they would say, well, you do it, no, you do it, no, you do it, no, you do it, no, you do it. And finally, they picked what appeared to me to be the junior man, and we went into the back room of the trailer where he took out a 2.5 by 3-inch little spiral notepad and a ballpoint pen, and he asked me my name and my address, and I gave it to him. And then he said, what did you see? And I told him the entire story that I've just told you. He wrote nothing down, and when I finished in about five minutes, I said, do you have any questions? And he said no, and I left. Now, that was my sole interview with the FBI.
Nobody with any aviation expertise ever contacted me. It wasn't until I sat down and had a rather extensive talk with Commander Donaldson that anybody asked me any real follow-up probing questions, clarifying what I said. Can you put yourself in this perspective? What did you see? What angle, etc. And that's when it struck me that why hadn't anybody contacted me? I wasn't really looking for my 15 minutes of fame, as Andy Warhol would say. But I just felt that I had information that might have been helpful to clarify exactly what did or didn't happen that night.
I thought this investigation was going to be a slam dunk because there was a lot of activity. I could see ship's lights, I could see aircraft lights, I could see a lot going on out there. 6 months went by and I'm watching TV and they're way off the mark. I called them up. I said, you need to send a technical expert out to talk to me. I got a lot of things I can tell you folks. And they seem to be missing that this plane was not just flying along and then exploded. I didn't even know that plane was out there when long before I see an object miles and miles away, close to the beach, heading outbound. There was clearly a cause and effect there. And he said, oh, do you want to change your story? And I got the impression that he was being a little hostile. And I said, no, I just really think you guys are way off the mark with your investigation and that you need to send some technical expert to talk to me. Because my impression of the 3 that came out to my home was that they were more of a screening committee. They weren't really investigating in detail any of the technical merits of what I may have seen. So, but of course I never heard from the FBI.
That was it.
That was it.
The National Transportation Safety Board holds a public meeting. Not heard any of the hundreds of eyewitnesses to the disaster. Just 5 days previously, FBI Assistant Director Kallstrom, his agency no longer actively involved in the investigation, wrote to the NTSB chairman, Jim Hall. The FBI objects to requests to disclose or include in the public docket the results of any interviews or re-interviews of the 244 eyewitnesses whose reports were examined by the CIA in connection with its analysis, and to calling any eyewitnesses to testify at the public hearing. In the same letter, Kallstrom objected to any public discussion of missiles, bombs, or explosive residue.
The investigators believe after the center fuel tank exploded, the front of the plane tore off, spiraling into the ocean, while the rest of the plane kept flying.
As an expert in the field, what's your opinion of that?
I find it highly unlikely, incredible, with the loss of a wing, with the loss of its pilots, cockpit and front end. I believe that that it would have tumbled, rolled, and basically dropped like a stone. And this is exactly what the radar data that has subsequently been looked at says happened.
User media 3 years ago, you give to all the world, without any discussion, the explanation that a 747 is able to climb for 3,000 feet at the speed of a rocket without giving any doubt about such an affirmation. And I don't understand that.
After a $36 million investigation, with 95% of the plane recovered, there is still no answer that satisfies everyone. Some who insist the plane was shot down by a missile showed up at today's meeting.
The eyewitnesses who saw a missile shoot down this plane are not being allowed to be heard by this hearing.
When Irvine refused orders to stop passing out flyers, he was removed. Inside, investigators said there is no physical evidence of a bomb.
I take exception to those who consistently distort the record and persist in making unfounded charges of a cover-up.
When you see a streak go up 13,800 feet in seconds, 4, 5, 6, 7 seconds, that's supersonic. It's supersonic. Only a fighter aircraft or a missile can achieve those kinds of speeds. And an investigator can pretty quickly determine, as the FBI guys did, that when you're 8 or 10 miles away and you see something go that high, that quick, it's just a matter of trigonometry. I mean, any high school kid can figure it out.
It's a missile.
It's got to be a missile.
The bottom line was there was no evidence of a bomb or a missile. Now, certainly the world thought that probably that's what happened that caused this tragedy, including the FBI. We thought that it was likely. Whether it was 90% in our own minds or 10% was irrelevant. We had to do the investigation. We did, and there just was no evidence of it.
So ends the government investigation. High voltage current jumped to a low voltage wire, igniting vapors in the center fuel tank. At least that's the most likely cause, says the NTSB. Boeing spent millions of dollars of its own money in an unsuccessful attempt to locate such an ignition source. Controversy surrounds the verdict, prompting calls for congressional action and answers about that still July night in 1996.
It's been 4 years since the eyes of the world turned to the waters just right off these shores. And it's been 4 years, but it's still very, very hard to come to terms with the suddenness and the scope of this tragedy.
"230 people have been killed. Families have been devastated. If somebody knows what caused this, you know, rather than talking about vague government people and you know, this witness who doesn't want to give their name or that witness, my goodness, anybody that's responsible and a caring human being, if they knew something had happened, should immediately go to the Department of Justice and share that information.
I give all of the eyewitnesses who saw something come up and enter that plane, come from either the ground, the water, or whatever. So many of them have not only been intimidated by the FBI and possibly other people, but with the CIA's rendition of, no, you didn't see it going from the ground or the water up, it was coming from the plane down. I give them such credit for sticking to their story, for being so tenacious with it. My belief is that the FBI, the government, is lying through their blackened teeth through me. And I don't like it. I'm madder than hell.
I lost my son 4 years ago. I am not speaking only in my behalf. I know that a lot of family from the 230 victims are waiting an explanation also. But if people think I will one time resign, then don't imagine that I don't even started to fight to receive the truth about what happens to this plane and what killed my son. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anytime you take away from the NTSB, which by congressional charter must be in charge, and have the FBI say that they will not investigate or interrogate any witnesses whatsoever, that immediately raises an issue, in my mind, about the politics of it.
We want to have some of the questions answered that have been asked, that have never been properly answered.
In what form?
Well, we have felt all along that it could only come about with a formal congressional hearing where people were put under oath.
If they persist, and they're talking about doing it, they're going to stick with this baloney and put it down on paper. When they sign it, they're targets, because the issue becomes ripe. What I'm saying, fellas, is you do that, you better start lawyering up.
What did bring down TWA 800? Will we ever know for sure?